So the native Florida apple snail is actually the largest species of snail or gastropod in North America. They are aquatic species, so that means they like to live in water, particularly fresh water. And they are the only native apple snail here in Florida. There's several different species of apple snails, but only one native apple snail, and that is the Florida apple snail. So these two shells are from native apple snails, or native Florida apple snails. And one of the main differences is the tip. They have a very strongly rounded spike point on that shell, and it's basically very round or blunt. Whereas on the non-native apple snails, they usually have a much pointier shell point. Another difference between them is the size. The native apple snails are only going to grow to be about 2 to 3 inches long, whereas your non-native apple snails can grow upwards of 5 inches long. The native apple snails have a very smooth groove around the shell, the coil of the shell, whereas the non-native apple snails have a very defined deep groove along the shell coil. The Florida native apple snails like to eat a lot of algae and detritus, which is the decomposing organic matter. But the non-native apple snails, they like to eat aquatic plants. So that is one reason that these pose a potential threat to the environment here in Florida, because they could be eating aquatic plants and disrupting the natural balance of our ecosystem. The non-native apple snails also reproduce very quickly, much more so abundantly than our native apple snails. They can lay anywhere from 500 to 2,000 eggs in a clutch, whereas our native apple snails, the Florida apple snail, only lays about 20 to 80 eggs in a clutch. So the Florida native apple snail is great for the environment and the ecosystem. It plays a critical role in our food chain or food web. They are the food source for many different species, including the endangered Everglades kite or snail kite. They are also eaten by limpkins, and young alligators tend to eat apple snails, as well as fish and even raccoons. So they do play a very important role as a food source for our native wildlife. The invasive apple snails are thought to have been introduced into the Florida environment through the pet trade. So one thing to remember is to never release your pets into the wild. It often disrupts the natural ecosystem and balance of nature. And if you have aquarium pets or aquarium animals like snails in your aquarium, never dump your aquarium water into a natural environment, because you could be introducing a non-native species into our backyard.